It's Isaiah chapter 9, where we're at, verses 1 through to 7. If anybody wanted a page number, I can give it to you. In the small Bibles, it's 658, and if you're in one of the big print Bibles, it's 1031. So that's where the passage is. Now, this is the second of our Christmas messages. And if you were here last Sunday, we considered Mary's prayer when she was pregnant with Jesus. It's found in Luke's Gospel, if you remember. And that prayer of joy is known as the Magnificat. But this morning, we're going back around 700 years before the birth of Jesus. So we're 700 years before Jesus came to earth and was born of Mary. And we're in the time of the Old Testament prophet Isaiah. So let's read the verses. And I hope you will find in these verses, we've got our 3 candles. You should find light, joy, and hope in this passage. So look out for the 3: light, hope, and joy. So we're starting at verse 1. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you, as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Amen. So if we can have the PowerPoint slides up, that would be great. Now, this passage is often read at this time of year as we remember the coming down to earth from heaven of Jesus. But as with every single Bible passage we ever read, we must always first ask ourselves the question, what would this passage have meant to the very people to whom this was written, living 700 years before the birth of Jesus? Because it means something special to us. But what did it mean to them? They wouldn't live to see Jesus 700 years later. Well, let me tell you what it meant to them. The likely background for Isaiah's prophecy is the coronation of a new king in Israel called Hezekiah. And up to this point, it had been nothing but bad news for the people living in Judah and Israel. The previous king, he was called Ahaz, and you read about him in the earlier chapters of Isaiah. He had been one of the worst kings ever. He failed to trust God, and it resulted in Judah facing invasion by their powerful northern neighbours. That was Assyria. And what do we find in the opening verse of chapter 9? We read, there was darkness, there was distress, and there was fearful gloom in the nation. The situation was bleak. Does that ring any bells? 2,700 years later, in our own world, we too know something of dark and difficult times, where there is war, where there's intolerance, where there's deep division. In many ways, nothing has changed in the plight of mankind. And even on a personal level, you too may be facing difficult and distressing situations of your own. But into this anxious and uncertain situation for this nation of Judah, Isaiah brings some good news for them. But it's even better news, as we will find out, for us 2,700 years later. Isaiah looks forward with optimism to better times ahead for them. You see, there could be a wonderful future for them if the new king, Hezekiah, and the people trust God. And Isaiah paints a threefold picture in this passage of light replacing darkness, of freedom replacing oppression, and of a special king, Hezekiah, replacing a bad king, Ahaz. And that's what it would have meant for them. Optimism for the future. So let's have a look at the first one, light replacing darkness. So if you can go on to the next slide, light replacing darkness. And Isaiah contrasts the darkness of despair and distress that they experienced under the previous king and the joy which could follow from their new king. And listen to some of Isaiah's prophecy that we find in the first two verses, because the first three verses is where we find this light replacing darkness. And he says, no more gloom for those who were in distress. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. And yet, no Israelite king ever fulfilled the wonderful promise. Not even Hezekiah. We read about Hezekiah. You have to get to, I think it's chapter 30 odd in Isaiah before you actually come to the write-up of his rule. And he was a good king. He turned out to be a very, very good king, just as prophesied by Isaiah. But he wasn't the perfect king. And Christians through the centuries have identified the perfect true king spoken of by Isaiah as King Jesus, this down-to-earth king. And in Isaiah, Jesus was anticipated. It's no surprise, is it, that Jesus spent much of his ministry in Galilee. That was what was prophesied in verse 1. In the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations. So many of Jesus' miracles, the Sermon on the Mount, happened by Lake Galilee, just as prophesied by Isaiah. Jesus was anticipated by Isaiah, and he sweeps his listeners far into the future with a glorious vision. And it will begin with the birth of Jesus, his earthly ministry, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension into heaven. And it will conclude with his glorious return to earth, when he will reign forever. That is the vision of Isaiah. And Isaiah's prophecy of light replacing darkness is perfectly fulfilled in Jesus. Matthew, in his gospel account of Jesus, repeats this second verse of Isaiah word for word about Jesus. That's how we know this is a fulfillment of prophecy. Matthew says so. Let me read you Matthew chapter 4, verse 16. And it goes like this. Matthew talking about Jesus. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. The light is Jesus, as we know. And remember how Jesus stood up in the temple and declared, I am the light of the world. That's what Jesus said. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. If you follow Jesus, he says you will never walk in darkness, but you will have the light of life. And Jesus is the great light for people who walk in darkness today, whether it's spiritual darkness or whether it's the darkness of difficult circumstances. Jesus is our light. And in the middle of our own anxieties, the Lord longs to be our great light, shining in our darkness, bringing a measure of peace to anxious hearts, hope and rejoicing to troubled souls. So that's the first thing, the first picture we get of the down-to-earth Jesus. He will bring light where there is darkness. But the second thing Isaiah says, that this new king that they were expecting, Hezekiah, that he will free the people from the Assyrian oppression. He will bring them freedom from their oppressor. And he says, Isaiah, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the rod of their oppressor. And that's what he's looking forward to for the new king. They could look forward to freedom in their land instead of oppression from the Assyrian Empire. But we know, don't we, 700 years later than that prophecy, it's Jesus who would be the ultimate liberator and rescuer of the oppressed. And Jesus says these familiar words. If we go to just the next slide. Sorry, Pete, I should have told you. We're on the next slide. Oh, we've jumped a whole lot of slides. There we go. And Jesus said those familiar words. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And what did Isaiah say? He spoke about shattering the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. And Jesus says, come to me if you are weary and burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And Jesus' invitation is to all who are burdened by their own failings and shortcomings, their sin, to come to him. Burdened by worries or anxieties, he says, come to me. Burdened by grief and pain, he says, come to me. And Jesus can take whatever burden you or I may be carrying and give us rest, freedom from whatever oppresses us. That's what Jesus promises. And finally, if we go to the next slide, Isaiah pictures that the future king Hezekiah would be a special king, replacing a bad king, Ahaz. And in verse 6, Isaiah expresses the hope that King Hezekiah will be a king with special qualities, that he'll be a wonderful counselor, even refers to him as a mighty God, an everlasting Father, a Prince of Peace. But we know, don't we, that no human king will ever be the perfect king. Only Jesus is the perfect king. So let's look at those 4 titles that Isaiah gives to the king. Jesus, the wonderful counselor. Wise as King Hezekiah might be, only King Jesus is the perfect fulfillment of the wonderful, wise counselor. Only Jesus can give comfort and guidance and the strength we really need throughout time and eternity. And if we need wisdom for our own situations, then Jesus is our perfect counselor. That is the promise. We have a perfect counselor. The next title, Jesus, mighty God. And Isaiah hopes that the new king will be given skill by God in battle. But Jesus is the King of Kings, the name above all names. Nothing is too hard for him, we say, don't we? And we have sung in the past. And if life is a battle for you right now, then King Jesus, the mighty God, can bring transformation. And then thirdly, Jesus, the everlasting Father. Now, this is not to mix up the Trinity, God the Father, Jesus the Son. What Isaiah is saying is, the one to come will be like a father to us. A king who will look after his people and care for them. When we put our trust in Jesus, we have one that will never stop loving us, one who is concerned and committed to what is best for us, like the perfect Father. And then finally, the title, the Prince of Peace, for this special coming King. When Jesus appeared to his disciples after his resurrection, he said, "My peace I give you." So many times in the Bible we read of God giving peace to those who are anxious. Do not fear, says God to us. And Isaiah looks forward to a day when there will be no more war and peace will reign. But we know, don't we, that only when Jesus returns in glory will there be perfect peace in this world. So let's just conclude. If we just go to the final slide. The picture I've got there is called The Adoration of the Shepherds, and it's by someone called Guido Reni. And you could see it for yourself for free, this picture, because it's in the National Gallery in London, in Trafalgar Square. Now, there it doesn't look a very big picture, and in fact, I've cut off the bit above, which has angels looking down on the scene. And that picture is one of the biggest pictures in the National Gallery. It's 5 meters high. That means it's 15 feet high. So if you were standing down below, it's higher than our ceiling. It's not quite as wide as that. So you can imagine how much I've kind of missed off if it goes up. It's a huge picture. Now, it does illustrate something of our sermon, because if you notice, where is the light coming from that's lighting up those figures? It's coming from the baby Jesus. Jesus is the light of the world there. He lights up the picture, and you've got Mary and Joseph and the shepherds looking on. Notice where every single person is looking. Where are they all looking? Who are they looking at? Every single person is looking at Jesus, apart from one who is carrying a sheep on his shoulder, who happens to be looking just somewhere over to the left. But everybody's looking at Jesus. Now, isn't that a lesson for us all? Jesus is the light of the world. The Apostle Paul says in Ephesians, walk in the light, he says to us. Walk in the light of Jesus, the light of Jesus. And they're looking at Jesus, the one who is mighty God, wonderful Counselor, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. That is where they're looking. So, what is our prayer? Our prayer is that this down-to-earth King Jesus would be a source of light, life, hope, and peace for you in your own situation as we approach this Christmas time.